Supreme Court chamber was bathed in a relentless, almost clinical white light that left no corner in shadow. It was the kind of brightness that didn't warm it exposed. Every reflection off the cold, polished marble walls seemed to amplify the formality of the place, reminding everyone present that this was no ordinary courtroom. This was where decisions outlived their makers. The air was heavy, almost motionless, as though even the oxygen understood it was in the presence of power. The scent of old wood and paper hung faintly in the air, mixed with the sterile bite of polished stone. The high ceiling, crowned with intricate molding, loomed above like a silent judge of its own. And then bang, bang, the gavel struck. The sound wasn't just loud, it was deep, resonant, and final, as if each strike could split the very air in two. Conversations died instantly, replaced by a silence so sharp you could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the room. From the raised mahogany bench, the justices sat in their black robes, elevated both physically and symbolically. The height of that platform made the difference between them and everyone else painfully clear. Those robes didn't just represent the law, they were a uniform of supremacy. You could feel it pressing down a weight that didn't come from the fabric, but from centuries of unchallenged authority. Spectators leaned forward ever so slightly, their bodies drawn in by an invisible pull. Some clasped their hands tightly as if holding themselves still could prevent them from disturbing the fragile order of the room. Others simply stared ahead, their eyes locked on the figures in power, each person silently aware that in this chamber, one sentence, just one, could ripple through the nation and alter its course forever. Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his expression carved in stone, his voice carrying the kind of weight that could crush a career in a single breath. Representative Jasmine Crockett, he said, every syllable deliberate. This court finds you in defiance of its orders. You are hereby fined $500 million. The number didn't just hang in the air, it detonated. Gasps erupted from the gallery, the kind that come when the human brain can't quite process what it's hearing. Reporters froze mid-keystroke, their eyes flicking up from screens as if to confirm they hadn't misheard. Even a few attorneys hardened by years of courtroom theatrics exchanged looks of disbelief. $500 million. In a courtroom where most penalties are measured in thousands or at most a few million, this was a nuclear figure. It wasn't about restitution. It wasn't about justice. It was a statement as sharp and heavy as the gavel in Thomas's hand. I have the power to end you. This wasn't the language of law. This was the language of dominance. The kind of figure designed to send a message not just to Crockett, but to anyone watching: challenge me, and you will be destroyed publicly, irreversibly. It was less a verdict than a warning wrapped in the cold authority of the highest court in the land. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett, expecting the usual shock, outrage, maybe even the kind of desperate protest that so many defendants resort to when faced with impossible odds. But she didn't give them that. She didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't even blink more than usual. Instead, Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the table, as though the $500 million fine was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Her gaze locked on Justice Thomas, steady, unwavering, and unblinking. It wasn't the look of a woman cornered. It was the look of someone measuring the distance between herself and her target. That silence, her silence, was louder than any protest she could have made. It unsettled the room. The reporters who had been ready to scribble down her outrage found themselves pausing, unsure of what they were watching. And Thomas, still gripping his gavel, looked down at her with the faintest flicker of something rare for him: hesitation. In that moment, it became clear Jasmine Crockett wasn't preparing to defend herself. She was preparing to strike back. And whatever was coming next, the court wasn't ready for it. Without a word, Jasmine Crockett reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. The movement was slow, deliberate enough to draw every gaze in the chamber. For a split second, even the clicking of cameras stopped. Her hand emerged holding a slim, yellow-tabbed folder. Ordinary at first glance, but in this room at this moment it radiated weight. Not the weight of paper, but the weight of what paper could do. She rose to her feet, heels tapping against the marble floor in a rhythm that echoed through the silence. Every step toward the clerk's desk felt like a countdown. Justice Thomas's eyes followed her, his expression carefully neutral, but the slightest tension curled in his jaw. When she reached the clerk, she extended the folder with a calm so sharp it could cut glass. And then, in a voice steady enough to fill the room without strain, she said, "Please enter that into the record. No theatrics, no trembling. Just 6 words, and yet they landed heavier than the $500 million fine ever could. Because in that instant, everyone in the room knew whatever was inside that folder had the potential to change everything. The clerk hesitated for a heartbeat before opening the folder, as if aware that whatever lay inside was about to detonate more than just a legal proceeding. Pages slid out neatly organized, stamped and dated. The first sheet alone was enough to pull the oxygen out of the room. Sworn depositions, wire transfer records, and internal memos linking Justice Clarence Thomas to 3 private lobbying groups. The same groups that had aggressively pushed for the unprecedented $500 million fine against Jasmine Crockett. One memo marked confidential contained language almost identical to the written opinion Thomas had issued just days earlier. Another document detailed a dinner 3 months ago between Thomas and senior executives from one of those lobbying firms. 2 weeks later, the first draft recommending Crockett's sanction appeared. Gasps rippled through the room. The cameras, which had been panning between speakers, all swung in unison toward the bench. The lens zoomed in, closing the distance between millions of viewers and Thomas's face. His usually unreadable expression had shifted just slightly, but enough. The set jaw was looser, the eyes less certain, the color in his skin draining under the lights. The truth wasn't just in the papers. It was written in real time across his pale face. At first, the sound was just a low murmur, like the rustle of wind through leaves. But within seconds, the entire courtroom was alive with it. Senators leaned toward each other in hushed, urgent whispers. Attorneys shifted in their chairs, trading glances heavy with disbelief. Several reporters who had been frantically typing to keep up with the proceedings stopped mid-sentence. Fingers hovered above keyboards. One by one, they lowered their laptops and phones, straining to catch every word coming from the clerk's lips as he read through the damning documents. The click, click, click of camera shutters slowed, then faded entirely. This was no longer about getting the perfect shot. This was about hearing the truth unfold in real time. In the gallery, something else was happening. You could feel it, an invisible shift in the air. Moments ago, Jasmine Crockett had been the target, the underdog staring down an impossible sentence. But now the balance was changing. People straightened in their seats. A woman in the second row nodded slowly, her lips pressed tight in a mix of vindication and anticipation. A man in the back clenched his fist, not in anger anymore, but in quiet triumph. The so-called weaker side was no longer on the ropes. They were moving in for a counterpunch, and every single person in that chamber knew they were witnessing a turning point. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat with the kind of calm that made people lean forward, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. She didn't rush, didn't shout. She let the silence carry her words before they even left her mouth. She turned fully toward Justice Clarence Thomas, her voice clear and deliberate, slicing through the charged air of the chamber. "You hide behind your robe to abuse power." The sentence landed like a thunderclap. It wasn't a lawyerly paraphrase or a cautious insinuation, it was a direct strike. The kind of statement that made even seasoned politicians suck in a sharp breath. Her gaze never left him. That robe is supposed to represent justice. She continued, her tone steady, but edged with steel, but you've turned it into a shield for personal interest and political payback. A few in the gallery murmured in agreement, their voices low but impossible to miss. The press pool leaned in pens poised, every ear in the room tuned to her next word. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was indicting him in the court of public opinion, right in front of the cameras, right in his own house. And for the first time since the proceedings began, Thomas didn't immediately respond. Outside the Supreme Court building, the air was already thick with curiosity. A handful of onlookers had been waiting since morning, hoping to catch a glimpse of the high-profile hearing. But the moment word leaked from inside Crockett just accused Justice Thomas to his face, the atmosphere shifted from quiet anticipation to electric urgency. People began to gather in clusters, their numbers growing with each passing minute. Some carried hastily made cardboard signs, "Justice, not power. No one above the law stand with Crockett." The chants started small, but they built like a drumbeat. Power Truth people echoed against the marble steps. On the other side of the barricades, news crews scrambled to reposition their cameras, sensing the story was no longer confined to the walls of the courtroom. Smartphones went up in the air, live streams began rolling, and within minutes the hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas was trending on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. Clips of her exact words, "You hide behind your robe to abuse power," circulated at lightning speed, replayed with captions, reaction videos, and split-screen commentaries. By the time the sun began its slow slide toward the horizon, millions had already watched it, argued about it, and taken sides. What had started as a hearing had now spilled into the streets and onto screens everywhere. And the court was no longer just deciding a case, it was standing at the center of a national reckoning. In the political arena, timing isn't just important, it's everything. And in that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had chosen her moment with surgical precision. Her words, "You hide behind your robe to abuse power," weren't delivered in a TV interview months later after the dust had settled. They weren't buried in a press release or lost in the noise of a campaign rally. They were spoken in the one place where their impact would be immediate, undeniable, and impossible to ignore, right in front of the man she was accusing, with the nation watching in real time. It's one thing to allege wrongdoing in abstract terms. It's another to stand within arm's reach of the most powerful judge in America and put the accusation on the record face to face. In that setting, truth doesn't just tell, it shakes. Her timing turned the phrase into more than just a criticism. It became a pivot point. In that instant, the room's energy shifted. Thomas, cloaked in the legal authority of the highest court, was suddenly not the untouchable arbiter, but a man on the defensive. And all it took was one line delivered at the exact moment when silence would have been easier and safer. Because when truth is spoken in the right place at the right time, it can do what no legal statute or procedural motion can strip power bare. It didn't take long for the echo inside the Supreme Court chamber to break out into the wider world. Within minutes, every major news network had interrupted their regular programming. CNN went live with a bright red breaking news banner showdown at the Supreme Court rep. Crockett confronts Justice Thomas. Their anchor's voice was measured, but electric, calling it a rare public challenge to judicial authority in real time. MSNBC rolled out wall-to-wall coverage, looping the clip of Crockett's accusation on repeat each time, freezing the frame right as her words landed, "You hide behind your robe to abuse power." Their commentators dissected every second, framing it as a watershed moment for accountability. Fox News, while critical of Crockett's politics, still acknowledged the gravity of the exchange. One panelist admitted on air, "We've never seen a sitting congresswoman throw a punch like this inside the Supreme Court. This is history, whether you like it or not." Across the spectrum, the spin varied. Some framed her as a truth-teller, others as a grandstander. But there was one thing no one could deny: this was no ordinary hearing. It was a national flashpoint. And the fact that it was happening live with unfiltered cameras and uncensored words only poured fuel on the fire. By the time evening broadcast began, it had a name: the Crockett Confrontation. And it was already being called one of the most explosive moments in modern political history. While the media frenzy raged outside the halls of the Supreme Court were a different kind of battlefield. Inside Justice Thomas's private chambers, the air was tense and stale. Staff members huddled around conference tables littered with legal briefs, laptops, and half-drunk coffee cups. Phones rang off the hook, some from reporters fishing for comment, others from political allies demanding answers. Thomas's closest advisors weren't in agreement. One aide insisted they needed to issue a firm public denial immediately to control the narrative before it got any worse. Another warned that going on record too soon could backfire if more evidence surfaced, and after what Crockett just dropped, more evidence was almost certain. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. A junior clerk, pale and visibly shaken, muttered that the documents Crockett submitted looked real enough to burn us all. The room went quiet for a moment after that. The split within Thomas's circle was widening. Half wanted to dig in and fight, half wanted to prepare for retreat. And in politics, that kind of division is fatal. Down the hall, other justices' offices weren't much calmer. Whispers about recusal and ethics review began circulating. For the first time in decades, the aura of untouchability around a Supreme Court justice was showing cracks. It started as murmurs in the hallways of Congress. But within hours, the whispers turned into official statements. The House Committee on Ethics announced they were opening a formal investigation into Justice Clarence Thomas. Their press release was brief, just a paragraph long, but the language was razor sharp. The committee will examine allegations of financial conflicts of interest and potential abuse of judicial authority. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers began to line up in front of microphones. Some spoke cautiously, calling for a thorough and fair review. Others were blunt. Senator Ramirez stood on the steps of the Senate chamber and said flatly, "No justice is above the law." if the evidence is what it appears to be. Clarence Thomas must step down. By the end of the day, at least a dozen members of Congress, both Democrats and a few Republicans, had publicly called for Thomas to recuse himself from all active cases until the investigation concluded. Cable news kept a running ticker of names joining the list, and every hour it grew longer. The message was clear: this wasn't just a PR crisis anymore. This was a survival crisis, and the clock was ticking. It hit the internet like a lightning strike. 47 seconds of grainy audio posted anonymously to an encrypted forum at 2:14 a.m. The voice was instantly recognizable to anyone who had watched the Supreme Court proceedings over the years. Justice Clarence Thomas. The clip began mid-sentence, his tone low but unmistakably confident. She thinks she can turn this into a victory. Let her. We'll make the fine the bait hit her hard enough to make her look greedy, then watch her cave. There was a pause followed by another male voice, unidentified, chuckling in agreement. Then Thomas again. Once the public sees her fighting over the money, no one will listen to the rest. We drown her in noise before she can even speak. The recording ended there, but it was enough. Within minutes, newsrooms across the country were working to verify the file. By sunrise, 2 independent audio forensics labs had confirmed it. The voice print matched Clarence Thomas with no signs of editing or tampering. It wasn't just a smoking gun, it was the plan laid bare. The $500 million fine wasn't just a penalty, it was a trap, and now the whole country could hear it for themselves. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to the nearest camera. She didn't post a victory tweet. She knew better, because the leaked 47 seconds, that was just the appetizer. She had the full recording, 61 minutes, crystal clear with names, dates, and a trail of voices no one could explain away. That afternoon, she stepped up to a press podium. No flashy backdrop, no teleprompter, just her a plain navy suit and a single sheet of paper in her hand. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, their lenses trained on her every move. She spoke evenly, every word deliberate. You've all heard part of the recording. I have the entire thing, and I'm giving those involved 48 hours to tell the truth, not to me, but to the American people. If they don't, I will. Then she stepped away. No questions, no further comment, just silence. It was a masterstroke. She wasn't simply revealing evidence, she was turning the clock into her weapon. For the next 2 days, the pressure wouldn't just be on Clarence Thomas. It would be on everyone tied to him, every lobbyist, every aide, every insider, wondering if their name was about to go public. The trap they had built for her had just been flipped, and now they were the ones caught inside it. The 48-hour clock hadn't even hit its first 12 before the first cracks appeared. Talk radio lines lit up with angry callers demanding accountability. Social media feeds turned into a flood of hashtags. Number 48 hours, hashtag full tape, hashtag resign now. On the courthouse steps, the crowd doubled overnight. Students, retirees, activists, all chanting in unison for Thomas to step down. Inside the judicial world, the pressure was even more suffocating. A retired federal judge went on CNN and said flatly, if this recording is authentic and it appears to be Justice Thomas, has compromised the integrity of the court. Then came the shocker. Anonymously at first, then on the record, 2 sitting Supreme Court justices quietly urged Thomas to consider recusal from all active cases until the matter was resolved. That kind of open dissent from inside the court was unheard of. By the end of the day, editorial boards from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, usually divided on almost everything, ran headlines calling for a pause on Thomas's duties. The dominoes were tipping faster now, and with each fall, the noise around the 48-hour deadline grew louder. The countdown was no longer just Crockett's weapon. It had become the nation's. On the morning of the 48th hour, there was no dramatic countdown, no staged buildup. At exactly 900 a.m., Jasmine Crockett's congressional website quietly updated with a single link, full recording, public access. Within seconds, the servers groaned under the weight of thousands of simultaneous clicks. The file was 61 minutes long, crystal clear and damning from start to finish. It began with the same lines the public had already heard, but then it kept going. Names were spoken, dates were set. Lobbyists laughed openly as they discussed ways to neutralize Crockett before the next budget session. Financial backers suggested the exact language for the fine, with one voice saying, if Thomas reads it himself, it'll stick. There was no room for plausible deniability now. The recording laid out a coordinated plan involving not just Thomas, but a network of political operatives, legal strategists, and high-powered lobbyists all working toward the same goal: crush Jasmine Crockett's credibility and silence her influence. By 10:00 a.m., every major news outlet had broken into live coverage. On split screens, anchors replayed key moments from the audio while legal analysts shook their heads in disbelief. By noon, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a blueprint for corruption exposed for the entire country to hear. And Crockett hadn't just survived the trap, they could all see now that she had sprung it open for the world to witness. The release of the full recording didn't just spark outrage, it ignited action. Less than 24 hours after the audio went public, both chambers of Congress moved with a speed rarely seen in Washington. In the House of Representatives, the vote was called mid-afternoon. The gallery was packed, the tension so thick you could feel it in your chest. When the clerk read the results, 387 to 48, the chamber erupted in a low, stunned murmur. Lawmakers from both parties, many of whom rarely agreed on anything, had voted in favor of an unprecedented measure: indefinite suspension of Justice Clarence Thomas from all official duties pending criminal review. Over in the Senate, the outcome was just as decisive. Senators cast their votes with an uncharacteristic lack of grandstanding. The result, 79 to 21, made it clear this wasn't about party loyalty anymore. It was about survival of the court's legitimacy. C-SPAN replayed the votes on a split screen alongside Crockett's press conference from the day before. Commentators called it the most significant congressional rebuke of a sitting Supreme Court justice in American history. For the first time in over 2 centuries, the legislative branch had sent a blunt, unmistakable message to the judiciary: no one is untouchable. When the final vote was announced, the chamber buzzed with the weight of history. Cameras swiveled toward Jasmine Crockett, expecting the smile of victory, maybe even a fist raised in triumph. But she didn't give them that. No grin, no applause, no grand gesture. She stood still, hands clasped loosely in front of her eyes, steady as if she were already thinking 3 moves ahead. When a reporter called out asking for her reaction, she simply leaned toward the mic and said, "We've shown the system can bleed." The words hung in the air, calm, almost quiet, but they landed with the force of a verdict. It wasn't gloating, it wasn't revenge. It was a statement of fact and a warning. Then she stepped back, letting the noise of the room swell without her. In that restraint was something more powerful than celebration. The understanding that this battle was just one in a much larger war. The vote to suspend Justice Thomas was barely a week old when the first wave of reform hit Capitol Hill. It came not as a suggestion, but as a bill drafted fast-tracked and backed by an unusually bipartisan coalition. The Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act was simple in language, but seismic in impact. For the first time in U.S. history, Supreme Court justices would be required to publicly disclose all financial holdings, gifts, and outside income on a quarterly basis. Submit to an independent oversight committee with full subpoena power to investigate potential conflicts of interest. The bill moved through committees at record speed. Lawmakers who had previously avoided even whispering about judicial reform were now lining up to co-sponsor it. Public pressure was relentless. Opinion polls showed nearly 80% of Americans across party lines demanded these safeguards. When the president signed it into law, the scene was broadcast live across every major network. Cameras captured the moment the pen left the page, and then the crowd erupting, not in wild cheers, but in a steady, sustained applause. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about rewriting the rules so that no robe, no matter how high the bench, could hide the truth again. The cameras were still rolling the ink on the president's signature, barely dry, when Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium. The crowd quieted, not out of obligation, but out of respect. She didn't waste time with formalities. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every moment that had led to this day. "If they come for you with power," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to sink in answer with proof. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a battle doctrine distilled into 10 words. In the weeks that followed, the phrase would be printed on protest banners, echoed in op-eds, and shared millions of times online. Retired judges quoted it in speeches. Law professors wove it into their lectures. For many, it was a reminder that truth isn't fragile, it's a weapon, but only if you have the courage to wield it. Crockett had done more than survive an attack from the most powerful seat in American law. She had turned that attack into a rallying cry for generations to come. Months later, the marble walls of the Supreme Court were a distant memory. Jasmine Crockett was back where it all began, walking the cracked sidewalks of her childhood neighborhood. The air smelled of street food and fresh rain. Kids rode past on bikes, their laughter chasing away the echoes of gavel strikes and political crossfire. She wasn't wearing a blazer or carrying a portfolio today. Just jeans, a simple shirt, and a quiet smile. People stopped her on every corner not to talk about court rulings, but to thank her for proving that even the most untouchable powers can be challenged. Local high school students invited her into classrooms, hanging on her every word as she told them that the fight for justice wasn't a career, it was a calling. Churches asked her to speak. Community centers painted murals of her holding a single sheet of paper, the document that changed everything. She never claimed to be a hero, but in the eyes of her community, she was living proof that one voice armed with truth can outlast an empire. And as she looked into the hopeful faces around her, Jasmine knew her fight wasn't over, because somewhere in the heart of the next generation, the battle had just begun. This story is more than a courtroom drama. It's a reminder that truth is the most powerful weapon you can hold. No matter how small you think your voice is, when backed by proof and courage, it can shake the highest walls of power. Justice doesn't always come quickly, and it rarely comes without a fight. But when you stand your ground, you inspire others to do the same. And that's how change begins, not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to stay silent. If you believe in standing up against injustice and fighting for truth no matter the odds, then you're in the right place. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and join our community of truth tellers, because together we can turn stories into action.